All right. So, where last we left off, we'd already covered the economic forces, I think, that broadly went into shaping the state, the ones that kind of run it through the 70s, as well as some of the weird stuff they were getting up to. We even talked about some of Michigan's elite families, but
Yeah, and I wanted to say real quick. So, like you said, the original families would have been like lumber families, and then there are, a handful of families that made their fortunes off of the auto industry and related industries off of that, and then the Romneys and the DeVos family are really like, in some ways, like Johnny-come-latelys. Like the Romneys, like Governor Romney was rich, but he wasn't as rich as Mitt Romney would become. And like the DeVos family are like almost cartoonish, They made their money off of a fucking like Ponzi scheme, basically. Or, like a MLM or whatever. So like they are like visible, but they are probably not the more important people. Like the Ford family, obviously, like some of these like more heavy hitters. Even the Rockefellers, had a big presence in Michigan. Like, just, like, there are, like, more powerful families that are, like, less in the public eye, is what I would say.
yeah, it's interesting.
Now, speaking real briefly here, I did look into a certain area, a certain thing called the Ionia State Hospital.
Yes.
And what I found was that there was a whole MKUltra subproject 39 in fact, that dealt specifically with Ionia State Hospital, where they were studying sexual psychopaths, and the subproject was basically interrogating sexual psychopaths under different circumstances, like without drugs, with multiple types of drugs, XYZ factors, and to try to like see how you could manipulate sexual psychopaths. And what I found was that Henry Lee Lucas, the serial killer, was there at the time that MKUltra was doing studies into sexual psychopaths. Henry Lee Lucas is a sexual psychopath, and he cites his time at Ionia as a time where he underwent a personality change that made him want to kill people. Now, my contention basically was that this could be evidence that he underwent behavioral modification experiments to make him more violent. I don't exactly know why you would want to do that, but this is MKUltra, right? And further, like Ionia State Hospital later went on to study psychosurgery for these psychopaths. They wanted to like put chips in people's brains and shit, and also like do lobotomies, all kinds of weird stuff. So basically, there again, like we were talking about with like the O'Brien stuff, like there's a kernel of truth there, and the truth is horrifying, and it goes so much further than I ever would have thought. But the difference is that we have proof of that. We don't need to like make it out to be worse than it is.
Yeah. And in the interest of maybe following up the Ionia topic, because I know you covered it on Program to Chill, it was a very good episode you did out there.
Thank you.
It brought up like an old memory of mine, I think, where it's like Michigan has had some degree of state funding for its mental health institutions. And this may be part of a larger, discussion on mental health care overall that I don't know we're both qualified to unpack. But what's been unique about Michigan's own history is very shortly after statehood, it decides that mental health care is one of those things that the state will have to be involved in, either in setting land aside or in setting funding aside, and it does both. So land is granted to build sanitariums and asylums, and then a certain amount of money is set aside to fund them. And I think the state goes from a total of 16 or so psychiatric institutions across the state from like the 1800s on to now what is left to being just 5 state-run inpatient institutes, which is unique from like an American perspective, right? Which is like, okay, from the get-go, this is seen as like something that has to be dealt with collectively. But what little I do understand is that like our paradigm for mental health care and incarceration both come from like early Quaker settlements from New England. And there's some kind of dark poetry, I can only call it that, in knowing that Ionia State Hospital became a penitentiary, or it became a correctional institute. It's no longer a psychiatric institute.
Yeah. No, like, have you ever read much Foucault?
I have not, but I know he speaks on like anti-psychiatry and, you know, the diagnosis of social problems as psychiatric problems, of course.
Yeah, and like basically like how society controls the individual, like it, you know, started, and like a lot of these techniques like were developed like in prisons and psychiatric facilities, and then were extended to like schools, hospitals, you know, the police and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it is interesting, right? Because like the state funded all of these like institutions, and then they did all these like heinous human experiments in them, right? There's also just this more like normal story of just like Ionia was also just very abusive to like African Americans who were there, separate from the MKUltra stuff, well, overlapping somewhat. And then like, what is the story of these clinics but that they end up getting privatized or shut down? And that is, you know, also largely what ends up happening to so many other institutions in society. So you really do see it's almost like a vanguard of like where society is going, is like what's happening in these prisons and clinics.
Yeah, like once again, this vulnerable population, in this case, like people with severe mental illness, not necessarily all of them like criminal, many of them not criminal, right? Just being kind of put out on their own or being thrust back onto their families who may not have the resources or know how to help them, you know?
Mm-hmm. And then that just makes the perception of like of Detroit all the more unlivable. It kind of increases the white flight and the capital flight. You know, these reifying systems of making everything worse, basically.
Yeah. But Ionia wasn't the only site where some of these weird things are happening. I think you also mentioned that Wayne State University may have been one of the sites where this happened as well. Or somewhere in Detroit there was a facility where this was going on.
Yes, at Wayne State University, I think there was a thing called the Lafayette Clinic.
Mm-hmm.
And both Ionia and the Lafayette Clinic were funded covertly by the Human Ecology Fund under the MKUltra umbrella, right?
Oh man, and that's, again, for the listener, the Human Ecology Fund funding these experiments. This is stuff that's already documented. This isn't stuff that like, you know, like some of the stuff we've said that might not be conclusive. This is the stuff that's already been written about.
We are on strong footing here. Like, there's really good documentation for all of this stuff. And in fact, it was, they, wouldn't you know, they were basically working on the same thing at Lafayette Clinic as Ionia, which is to say, uncontrolled aggression.
Mm-hmm. Basically, like, we can tell that, like, this age that we're speaking of the 70s, as this, like, rise and fall of, like, Great Society liberalism is also the era in which a lot of this weird sub rosa shit is going on. And we've talked about it from the perspective of MKUltra, the classic almost parapolitical story at this point, right? But maybe let's speak on like the selected population this might have been deployed on. And we haven't fully painted our picture of the 70s, right? Because we should tie this into the student movement and maybe radical politics in Michigan at this era, right?
That's right. And I'm trying to think. I'm like, okay, well, I'll just say it, and I won't go into too much detail, but like, there are really two, Michigan, like, if you are the powers that be and you're trying to control society, there are really two groups of people you need to worry about in Michigan. We're talking student radical movement and the black population.
Yep.
To an extent, also labor unions, so I guess maybe three. And wouldn't you know, they actually overlap quite a bit, right?
Mm-hmm.
And really quick, I just have a little bit on this. Like, Michigan has always been the site of very weird psyops, psychological operations, against all three groups. And one of the ones that I'm particularly interested in is the Nation of Islam, which I consider to be essentially a psyop on the black population. I know that probably might sound inarticulate coming from me, but I think that there's a strong case there. Basically, the short version is that the Nation of Islam might have not actually been started by a black man in the first place. Wallace Fard Muhammad was maybe just, like, no one knows like where this guy came from, and he had quite light skin, is what I would say. He joins the Moorish Science Temple, which is essentially like this weird Rosicrucian order, from which also the 5%ers and the Black Israelites also like derive. And so basically he sets up the Nation of Islam, and then he basically he sets it up in 1930. In 1932, there's this bizarre story about a possible human sacrifice. And then Wallace Fard Muhammad just straight disappears from the face of the earth in 1934. And from that point on, it's the Elijah Muhammad game, right? Mm-hmm. With Malcolm X coming and going, tragically. But basically, the Nation of Islam is just, I can't unpack it. It's just, it is like a weird psyop, is what I'd probably say, and it has its roots in Detroit.
This is where I have friends I can speak to on this who can confirm this, and I wish neither me or you being black in this case, right? So we can't speak authoritatively on this. We're more so well-informed observers than anything else at best.
Yes.
I've talked to both my partner and my buddy about this, where it's NOI, Hoteps, Black Israelites, whatever you want to call that umbrella, largely, right? Is they found the golden medium of appropriating the style and rhetoric of black radicalism, but basically saying what is either fundamentally reactionary at best or nonsensical at worst. And even there's less politically motivated figures like Tariq Nasheed to this day, right? Who at this point don't have a real political project. They're more so just pickup artists calling women sluts types, really, that don't. They're not even
cultural grievances type of shit.
Really, really at that point, right? Who come out of that NOI tradition, and it's there is something to be said about these enclaves of what I'll only describe as distraction masked as radicalism.
Mm-hmm.
that fundamentally never get like shut down or challenged. I think if people do speak on them, they speak correctly on them being wrong, but either don't know this connection to weird stuff or like have just decided to not pay attention to it, that like they're not going to draw the connection. Because correctly, these guys are annoying, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I love the bow tie look. It's a hard look, but
I
there's a
just,
reason why like they killed Malcolm X when he became like a normal Muslim. Yeah.
I mean, there's this story of like Malcolm X basically going on Hajj and like telling someone in Mecca about like the NOI shit and like Yaqub and all that. And this guy basically looking at him like, "Are you crazy? Is that Islam?" And then he was like, "Damn, I gotta really step it up. I gotta practice this shit seriously."
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, it's one of those things where it's like we should both maybe endeavor to get people of color to speak on this, because there is correctly as you stated, like a degree of damage these guys are doing that is not incidental. It is not unintentional. It is a co-optation of the appearance of radical politics to basically either waste time or either like cultural war resentment or reactionary tendencies in certain elements of black populations, that it's just unfortunate, you know?
Yes, and luckily there are more than enough white organizations that have similar dynamics going on that we're about to talk about, to where we don't have to dwell too much on the Nation of Islam, for sure.
Well, I mean, let's be the first ones to do it. Can we say that like Christian identity stuff, white supremacy stuff is like the Hotep formula writ large for that audience, you know?
Oh, absolutely, Audi. Like, okay, I've said before, right? Mormonism is like soft Christian identity, and it basically does do the whole like white guy wearing the Egyptian headdress. Like, yeah, like this is, the original version was like, yeah, actually, like they were ancient British guys, and like Mormons have that. They basically do have a mode where almost all world history is somehow related to them, and it's largely without any evidence, obviously. And yes, it is absolutely the same trick. Like, you can basically just make up archaeology and just make up weird stories, because the Nation of Islam is basically at its core, it was like half like a UFO cult, half Rosicrucian, weird occult shit.
Uh-huh.
And that's what Mormonism is. It is basically the same trick. Even almost like down to some of the sartorial choices.
Oh,
like,
now I got
why
to
do
shut.
all the missionaries look like freaking like they're from like the 1950s? It's the same freaking thing.
This is like we're approaching a new synthesis here, right? This is my
Mm-hmm.
wife. This is my partner's joke. I'm gonna steal. I give her full credit for this one, but like she was basically asked me like, what would an Indian Hotep be like? It's like she made this joke about this guy like we was gurus, but it's like no, that's literally Hindu for motherfuckers. They are exactly like that, and I'm just wondering like there is this weird like trend. Like I've noticed this. Like every culture has this guy who's like reactionary, not at all well read, not at all ready to admit he doesn't know shit he's not qualified to speak on. And if you ask him like what's his cosmology of history, or you just let this guy talk too long, it'll just be like my ethnicity invented X, Y, and Z. And like the tamest version of this is like every ethnicity thinks they invented chess. That's the most innocent version of it. And the most like perverse, fascistic, horrible instinct of it is like we invented civilization, you dogs deserve to die. But there's like everyone seems to have that guy. It's a universality that unites us all that we gotta stop. We gotta stop it.
Absolutely.
Okay. Let me get out of my Zizekian framework there. So you're right that the NOI is this bizarre formation that has the I don't know what to say conclusively. Oh, go ahead.
Oh no, I forgot one other thing. Okay, you remember I did that or I used to do a long series on Japan.
Yeah.
Dude, the Nation of Islam got funding from Imperial Japan at one point.
Okay, that explains why.
They were a fucking psyop, like an actual one.
Okay, it makes sense because like someone on Black Twitter was tweeting like, "Dude, how did the Hoteps make it to Tokyo?" You're just walking in Tokyo and you're hearing Black Israelite shit. You're just like, wait a minute.
And then my hypothesis is that at a certain point, probably around World War II, the FBI took over.
Okay.
That's my theory. I can't prove that, but I know for sure they did get like funding from Japan. That for sure is like academically cited.
That's a unique connection. I had no fucking.
And I'm pretty sure that I'm pretty sure there is paper on like FBI informants all throughout the Nation of Islam. I don't think that's like crazy. In fact, I think that like a lot of the work on like who killed Malcolm X kind of shows that to be the case.
Do you think it was Farrakhan who killed Malcolm X, or he just had a role in it?
I'm not in the weeds as to the particulars, but I'm certain he was, at a minimum, had a role in it.
Okay. This is all very new territory for me. I'm just like, wow.
Dude, I'll do you one more. Okay, this is not. This is Jimmy shooting from the hip. But
okay.
I've heard from other researchers and speculation and reading that Farrakhan might have received like NLP training, possibly of the type that possibly like Hubbard type shit, which I don't think is that crazy because
NLP
they're a cult, neuro-linguistic programming.
Oh fuck no! Oh god!
Because he has a very unique way of talking that does tend to like get in your head and almost like teach you a new vocabulary, giving you a new framework for like thinking. That's like NLP shit.
That's something that like I'm just fixated on now, and like I want to.
It's what cults do.
Yeah, I gotta talk to specifically Pico Goller about this because it's like
you should definitely do episodes on that topic. I'm not gonna do it necessarily. Like
we might get you
about
on.
It, but
we might get you on.
Yeah, I could at least do the Japan part. Yeah,
we could at least get you as like the subject matter expert on some of this and maybe like field our questions. But like, yeah, like the discussions I've had with Black folks about this is like these segments like have like basically turned like Black radicalism into like an aesthetic and like a style of speech.
Mm-hmm.
To the point that like the Black Panther himself is like it's like a mimetic identity more than it is like a cadre of revolutionary socialists, you know, fighting for reversing injustice. You know what I mean? So whether it's like,
I sure hope that doesn't happen to the non-Black U.S. left. Oh wait, it freaking did there too.
Oh god, exactly. So using the Nation of Islam there as microcosm, let's talk broadly about the left at this time. So as we stated last time around, the American left is turning more anti-communist in its character. The communists have been purged from the unions. And basically, I'm not. How do I put this? Right? Is that the favorability among the American left for the Leninist Stalinist line isn't as popular. So there's this push ideologically for this more like democratized or open form of the left. There's a lane for that opening up. And to speak specifically here, we're talking about the SDS and the Port Huron Statement first. So the SDS comes out of a broader tradition in the I think it was called the Industrial Defense League or something. Upton Sinclair was part of this organization, basically, and it was like socialists who were involved in the academy or were college students who had socialist views. The SDS comes out as like a reconstitution of that. It's student led, and they come together at this retreat hosted by the UAW. Walter P. Reuther basically hosts them. And I'm going to be honest, it's cool that a union has like retreats and places for people to hang out. I think that's cool.
Yeah.
So the Port Huron Statement is kind of their manifesto on how they believe the left needs to be reconstituted and how they define the student movement in their era. Now, so go ahead.
Let me jump in. Here's where it's so interesting, okay? Because like I feel like possibly I let Reuther off the hook a little bit. But like Victor and Walter Reuther worked for the CIA at different points, okay? So, for example, they went over to West Germany to bolster labor unions there. They were working for the American Federation of Labor, but the CIA was using the AFL to basically bolster trade unionism so that West German communism, like communist elements, wouldn't. Basically, there was a period in the Cold War where like the CIA was bolstering anti-communist trade unions to like push off the communist trade unions.
Makes sense.
And so like there was this interesting period where like the Reuther brothers were working with intelligence to do that.
Were they aware they were working, or
Germany? Well, that's the interesting thing too, because listeners can check out also my episode with Rob McKenzie on.
That was a good one too.
Yeah, and like especially his book, which documents how like AFELT, which was like the American, whatever. I'm too tired to remember it, but like basically there were these labor unions that were working hand in glove with intelligence and also with U.S. industry. And so like they did know after a certain point. And in fact, one of the reasons why they ended up trying to kill I'm leaving undefined, tried to kill the Reuther brothers was because they kept being very ambivalent as to the work they were doing, because it kept really ultimately backfiring for even the anti-communist labor unions, because like they didn't really want the labor unions. They were just using this as a cudgel to hit the communists over the head internationally at first, and also later on domestically. Gotcha. So anyway, where we're going with that is the Port Huron Statement is a very interesting document, right?
It is, and I want people to pay attention to the core contents of this document. So we'll start with the secondary position in the document before we get to the primary one. I'm gonna give it the game away if I say the first one. So the secondary point of the Huron Statement is they see the role of the student movement, and broadly so the academy, as this permanent institutional position that the left can house itself in order to champion and defend both grassroots organizing for social issues as well as unions. And this would mark a later descent, as some would call basically the retreat into the academy of the left, and how our modern left is more intellectualized than it is organized or militant in some capacity. Now, of course, there's far more to lose these days. These, organizations are more demobilized and debilitated than they once were. So whether by necessity or by design or by fleeing, the left has become intellectualized in the West, particularly in the United States, as a result of that. I also think that the decision to retreat into the academy because it has institutional legitimacy is, well, it's interesting, right? Because it's like, yeah, it's an institution, but it's an institution of the United States. And if you're smart, you should know that, like, it's still a bourgeois project. Its institutions still, fuel and bolster that order. So the academy itself is not this inherently progressive or impartial or objectively,
or even adversarial.
Oh yeah, not at all to to the powers that be. I mean, my pet example when people bring up the academy is like, well, take a look at Woodrow Wilson, right? Is that guy was an academic and he was basically like the most reactionary figure of his era. You know what I mean? Literally getting the United States involved in World War One, exacerbating the contradictions of race, literally like being the Klan president. That's how I view him. And then more broadly too, right? Like the Dunning School of Southern history, right? Where they view the lost cause myth of the South and the Confederacy and try to provide intellectual justifications for it. So I'm not here to shit on academics. I'm not here to shit on the academy vociferously, but what I am here to say is that, institutions are not inherently incorruptible. They are as susceptible to ideology as an individual is, because they are staffed by individuals. It's, once again, these things may be structural, but structures are staffed and operated by people.
Yes.
So that was the secondary point of the Port Huron statement. The first one, listen carefully because this may sound familiar to you as someone whose crucible may have been forged in 2016 and 2020. The primary claim of the Port Huron statement is that it is incumbent on them to demand and work towards a Democratic Party that is accountable to working class and left-wing interests, and that joining the party, working within it, and infiltrating it from the inside is how we're going to do it, and being more involved in participatory forms of democracy is our way through it. If this sounds familiar, raise your hand. Because if this sounds like progressive media circles, if this sounds like DSA, if this sounds like whatever wing of the Democrats you were involved with pre-2016, this is the formative crucible of the liberalism whose fumes you were huffing. They were probably based in something good in the 70s, and you are now running on fumes of those particular views to this day. And it's not often discussed, but this is true that the founders of the DSA were present at this. Michael Harrington, I think, was one of the signatories of the Port Huron statements. Went on to become the chairman of the DSA. So if you're a DSA member and this sounded familiar to you, yep, that's why. And I would argue that the modern left is not necessarily tainted by this view, but has inherited this conception and this framework for its political origin and its worldview within how it should act within the American context.
Yes. Now, the argument that I'm making is that basically the Port Huron statement doesn't say that it is anti-communist, but there were factions there that wanted a statement talking about communism being evil.
Mm-hmm.
There were factions that were communist, however, so it was a debate over the nature of the Port Huron statement. And Audie, I don't know if you've ever seen The Big Lebowski.
I mean, that's one of the first scenes in The Big Lebowski, right? Where he's basically saying, I was there when they signed the Port Huron statement. Actually, I don't know.
He said the original Port Huron statement, not the compromised second draft. So what we're seeing here is that, okay, this whole thing happens because of the UAW through the Reuther brothers, who were working for the CIA. And then this statement, which is largely one of the key texts for the modern US left, essentially is doing a weird song and dance where they're not officially anti-communist, but they're not embracing it. Not to sound too conspiratorial here, I'm just saying, like,
that's not conspiratorial at all. This is not conspiratorial. In fact, like, this attitude is what shapes later formations like DSA. I mean, like, Michael Harrington, as I mentioned earlier, has this like schizoid approach to Marxism almost, where it's like you can have socialist action without Marxism as its backing thing. And this idea that, like, we have to basically throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. You throw out Marxism because Stalin equal bad, you know?
Exactly. And Harrington was a Shachtmanite Trotskyite. He was from the Independent Socialist League, which was a marginal group that had no basis in the labor movement. And they were hoisting their anti-Stalinist line. So, just throwing it out there. I'm just asking questions, folks.
It's just one of those things where it's like, you know, if you just joined DSA because you wanted to do something, and you're like, huh, everyone sure still seems mad about the Second International. What happened here?
It's a real bro moment.
It's just stuff where it's like, I don't know. Like, I'm not going to say that everyone in DSA is doing a bad job or everyone in it is a Trotskyist. You know, that's not true. But it's fundamentally, like, it's a bizarre formation as far as socialist parties go, where it's like it's a self-identified big tent. All sorts of people are in it, and you get
it's like the bizarro version of the Democratic Party.
Well, and here's the thing I was going to get at. So, see Derek Varn of the Varn blog, if anyone's familiar with it. I think he's a good resource. Definitely, if you're like a beginner to some of this history, he's a good resource to follow. He was talking about Harrington and basically was like, if the DSA structure doesn't make sense to you, it's because it's by design. It's decentralized to mirror the Democratic Party structure, and what the DSA was supposed to be was an interest group that lobbied on behalf of the good name of democratic socialism to the Democratic Party. It was never meant to be anything beyond that. Then 2016 happens because of a dude named Bernie Sanders, and they've been off to the races since.
And look at all the wins that they've racked up.
Not to say that all the work is useless, not to say that everyone there is like, yeah, but it's again, it's like the contradictions are apparent, and you can't understand a contradiction or begin to unravel it without exposing some of this history first.
I will neither confirm nor deny membership in the DSA. Now, if we do want to be conspiratorial, though, let me throw one factoid at you. So you know Tom Hayden of the Port Huron statement and various groups that we're, going to go through here soon.
Yeah, Tom Hayden was a member of the Chicago 7. He's also from Royal Oak, Michigan, if I'm not mistaken.
Royal Oak, Michigan. What is that? Does that signify anything?
Royal Oak is one of the... Tom Hayden. Let me make sure I'm... To be him, right? Yeah, it's him. It's him. So Royal Oak doesn't confirm anything specifically, but it is a suburb right outside Detroit, connected by Woodward Avenue. It's still one of the primarily like wealthy ones, so to speak, but it's mostly like a white flight suburb that's the closest to the city and still maintains a lot of like cultural and economic influence, so to say.
Now here's a little fact about Tom Hayden. growing up, the parish priest for Tom Hayden's church, he grew up Catholic. The priest there was Father Coughlin.
No shit.
Yes.
The Father Coughlin.
Kind of makes you think, doesn't it? So, here's what I would advance to your listeners. The New Left, such as it is, I think, was infiltrated from the jump by certain agents who perhaps steered it in unproductive directions. That's my contention. As to any one person, I think you would just need to see the trajectory of their life and to see what happened to them to probably make an assessment.
It's a hell of a connection, dear God.
My contention basically is that the New Left and like Michigan is like a major node of the New Left. Mm-hmm. So like looking at the Michigan contingent, you're almost looking at the whole network almost, because everybody at least went to Ann Arbor and like, you know, these places and at least would attend conferences, even people not from Michigan. Basically, here's my contention. The rich, at the end of all of this stuff, which includes literally like domestic terrorism and like insurrectionary politics and declaring war on the United States itself and setting off bombs and shit. At the end of the day, the rich kids ended up in professorships and a lot of the poor kids ended up in prison or dead. Now, as to which were agents, I think it's not always the case where the rich kid was the agent, but it's not always not the case either. It definitely is a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, I mean, so you did like kind of skip a step there, which is basically like as the SDS is losing some traction, more radical elements of it form what's called the Weathermen. Was Ted Kaczynski part of it at all, or?
I don't think he was. I would freak the hell out if he was. I always thought he was like kind of apolitical. Like, when would he have been? Because he was at Harvard. He was at Harvard as like a teen, and then where did he teach college?
Let's see. Yeah, he was teaching mathematics or something too, I think.
Yeah, I forget which college he was teaching at. Let's see.
Crazy smart guy. It's very weird.
Oh, University of Michigan. Interesting.
There we go.
I forgot that there was a Michigan element to the Kaczynski story.
They enrolled at the University of Michigan, where he earned his master's and doctoral degrees in mathematics in 64 and 67, respectively. Not his first choice for post-grad education. He applied to UC Berkeley and University of Chicago, which accepted him but offered him no teaching position or aid. Michigan offered him an annual grant of $2,310, equivalent to $20,000 and change in 2021, and a teaching post.
That's right. Now, I'm not aware of him interacting in any way with politics around this time, which is not to say that he didn't. I'm just not aware of it. But god dang if I'm not now very interested in the possibility.
Yeah, I have no way to like the Unabomber stuff is stuff I really don't understand much. For whatever reason, like I always heard that he was more influenced by anarchist thought. You see some of it in like his manifesto. Again, I don't even know if like it's true that he wrote it or not. Is that something that you can reasonably suspect or not?
I mean, I've never heard any good question. Like, I'm not aware of any indications that he didn't write it. It is
Okay.
interesting, though, the possibility that he was not the only person, because or the Unabomber bombings alluded to a freedom club that at first they thought was more than just like one guy, and who knows, maybe it was more than just one guy. I don't exactly
PTK
trust
vibes once
the
again.
FBI. Hmm.
Oh gosh.
For your listeners out there, Ted Kaczynski was subject to MKUltra experiments.
And that is something that's documented, right? Like,
Yeah.
yeah, his lawyers later attributed his hostility towards mind control techniques to his participation in Murray's study. Some sources have suggested that Murray's experiments were part of MKUltra, the CIA's research into mind control. Chase and others have also suggested that this experience may have motivated his criminal activities.
That is a good point. It is not officially considered MKUltra. It's just the same types of experiments.
Well, if you're doing the same type of experiment, if an experiment is done under MKUltra's aegis, does a mind control it make? Who's to say? Dear God.
So, what I would say probably is there's definitely, because it was at Michigan where he was having the gender dysphoria as well.
Yeah.
There's a lot of probably a lot more to the story as to his time in Michigan that has not been told.
Yeah, it's very odd because like just looking at the Wikipedia and like glimpsing through it, right? It's very odd that like his professors are saying like he's a smart guy, he seems to have been having a good time. Kaczynski himself is like, it was the worst time of my life. And then this there's this documented period, and Kaczynski themselves identify that they had, this sense that they identified as female and they wanted to undergo gender transition. I don't think Kaczynski ever followed up with it, though. Is that the case?
My understanding,
stopped entertaining it.
My understanding is that he didn't continue with that, and like it doesn't seem to come up before or since, which is not to say that it didn't happen. It is weird that comes out like almost as its own disclosure many years later. I'm not saying it's all fabricated. I'm just thinking that like possibly portions of the story come out at different times. Like it is just interesting to think about.
It is a weird detail to mention, but also it's like, again, like with like this bizarre, like understated stuff from his like professors that like, well, Kaczynski seems to be doing okay, but then privately Kaczynski admits they're not doing well. It's odd.
It is odd, and given the bizarre experiments he was going under, I'm not sure whether that's... I mean, I'm not even sure if that's like... I'm not even sure how much any part of like this, what's been released, is actually true. I'm not trying to say that it didn't happen, though. There's just still so many unresolved questions with with Uncle Ted's story.
Yeah. I mean, again, once again, bizarre Michigan connection rears its head. But the weathermen are unrelated.
Yeah, as far as we know. I did want to point out, though, actually, so factions that would become the Weathermen closed the SDS national office, which functionally shut down what was essentially a mass org of 100,000 members across multiple campuses. And the Weathermen, the group that came out of that, basically shut down what was effectively an effective organization, the SDS, in favor of guerrilla actions which would alienate the masses.
Now, is this happening at the same time as like the Baader-Meinhof group in Germany, or is it like there's a slight overlap between the
loosely around the same time? I think, yeah.
Okay.
Like, I think they might have started a little sooner, but yes. Like, basically what we're talking about is that, like, okay, I have, like, one of the weathermen, like, his name was John Jacobs. He was talking about the days of rage. And this passage says, weathermen would shove the war down their dumb fascist throats and show them, while we were at it, how much better we were than them, both tactically and strategically as a people. In an all-out civil war over Vietnam and other fascist U.S. imperialism, we were going to bring the war home. Turn the imperialists' war into a civil war, in Lenin's words, and we were going to kick ass. Now, what I want to emphasize, basically, is, like, the weathermen took real righteous anger about the war in Vietnam, which was just like a genocidal, horrible, fascist, imperialist war. And they basically, I don't know if you noticed, Audie, but they said that they wanted to show, first of all, how much better we were than them. Like, my contention is that this sort of belies, like, the essentially, like, rich, entitled, like, college radical mindset. Like, where the fuck in, like, historical materialism do you go off about how much better you are than your opponent? Like, what? That's like a moral judgment. That's not, like, anything. That's not Marxian, you know? Like, what are you talking about? And second of all, you're declaring war on the United States. Like, what? Do you think that's a good tactical move? Like, what? Like, what is this? And then they literally quote Lenin, and then they engage in terrorism. And Lenin was always very much against terrorism. So either you don't know Lenin very well, or you're just, like, using it, you know, in bad faith. Like, which is it? I don't. So
that's an interesting point to bring up too, because even today, like, there's this beef that keeps getting relitigated of, like, grassroots organizers versus labor, what is basically called, like, red diaper babies, or, like, labor aristocracy. So that divide still exists even today. Wow. Yeah.
And so, like, basically, the Weather Underground would go on to just bomb, like, a ridiculous number of, like, instances of bombing. Like,
yeah,
let me see. I forget the number exactly, but just, like, thousands and thousands of bombs they would set off, mostly, like, against property, not people. Typically, if anyone died, it was usually them blowing themselves up, rather than, you know, blowing up, like, enemy, like, combatants, I guess. But, like, the point that I'm trying to make is that, like, the Weather Underground engaged in terrorism, and it freaked out normal people.
Mm-hmm.
Like, even though you could maybe make a moral case that, like, you should oppose the U.S. war machine in the context of Vietnam, like, not at a certain point, like, declaring war on the United States as a relatively small, like, vanguard party of, like, far left politics is either just plain stupid or intentionally leading people astray. And it's like, okay, which one is it? Like, probably, depending member by member, it was probably certain amounts of both.
And if not that, definitely, like, there's probably decent reason then to suspect, like, roles of provocateurs basically encouraging the violence.
That's right. And if you were to go to the Wikipedia page, you would see a whole category called COINTELPRO for the Weather Underground.
Yep, here we are.
However, it doesn't actually go very much into what COINTELPRO did to the Weather Underground. It mostly talks about the fact that, interestingly, groups associated with the Weather Underground broke into an FBI office to find documents to show that COINTELPRO existed. Which was like a cool thing, trust me, like by all means. But like, were there COINTELPRO or other agents, maybe chaos agents within the Weather Underground? Almost certainly. Like, basically what I'm saying is that like the members of the Weather Underground whose names you might know, who ended up as professors, I question whether they were genuine. That's what I would say. Like Bill Ayers. Like if you end up in a organization like this and then you come out of it somehow, you've declared war on the United States and then you go underground and you come out of it and you end up a professor somewhere. I'm sorry. I just don't think you were actually fighting the United States.
Yeah, I think once again the point stands that like I don't know, it stinks to high heaven.
Yeah. I mean, you know, like with the Black Panthers, all of the top leaders ended up dead.
Yeah.
And like for sure a fair amount of the Weather Underground ended up dead, but usually it was due to blowing themselves up. Like a few of the guys ended up with pretty long prison sentences, but you know, some of them walked away almost like with successful careers. Like I don't know, like I definitely feel like I'm making the case poorly, but I'm just saying like that's my contention.
I think once again it's like maybe it's not our job to make the case properly, you know, but it is
Mm-hmm.
it is once again odd. That's like, okay, you did this and you got an academic gig out of it. That's strange.
Well, okay, let me just raise the the Michigan militia.
Yeah. Let's go to the right now instead of the left.
Well, you know how they basically had that, what was that plot to like kidnap the governor?
So yeah, we don't need to rehash this particular story. I
Right.
think my listeners should be familiar with it.
No, but like I'm just saying, like the point is basically like you take a group which is dangerous, whether that's essentially people who would join a militia or people who would join the Weather Underground. You get them to basically do actions, but the Weather Underground mostly does like property damage bombings that don't really hurt anyone. You get these radicals to go underground, and then you take out the ones that might actually be genuine. You get some agents in there to provoke some shit, and then at the end of the day, half of them end up good Democrats, and the other half end up either dead or in jail. Does that sound like an inciting operation to you? That's all I meant with like bringing up the governor plot, basically.
No, that makes sense. That makes perfect sense. I think we can definitely safely say then that like the left in all its forms basically was either infiltrated, demobilized, or suppressed in certain capacities. And then we've talked about the student movement and how it's been suppressed. We did touch on NOI. Do we want to maybe touch on the White Panthers and the Michigan militia as well?
Yeah, I mean, the White Panthers were basically the same story, where it was just like a radical group initially like trying to support the Black Panthers. Excuse me. Basically, like to channel white radicals into a path that like was genuinely the initial idea is good to like support the Black Panthers. And you know, I think that like the head of the White Panthers, essentially, that John Sinclair, I think I do get a read that he was probably more genuine because he had to end up like in exile living in Europe to basically avoid various charges for, honestly, some pretty dumb shit that the White Panthers kept doing.
Oh gosh.
Kick out the jams, right?
Kick out the Jans, what?
Oh, that's just the MC5. That was a band associated with the White Panthers, and that's one of their songs. It's like, kick out the jams, motherfucker.
Okay, I'm really showing my age here then, because it's like the
It's
punk
all
scene.
good.
The punk scene is one of those that just like I unfortunately don't have that much experience with. It's not like I'm anti-punk or anything. It's just like I don't have that much formative knowledge of it. I'll definitely check it out, but like the punk scene and shit.
Yeah.
But from our like cohort on Twitter, most folks tend to have been like either tangentially or like were like in the punk mold before getting into some of this stuff. But
Mm-hmm.
I'm definitely the odd man out. I was more of like I'd say like yeah, R&B has been like my focus musically at least.
Ooh, smooth jams.
Yeah, but I think yeah, MC5 is also again. So this was a band that was tied to the White Panthers and may have also been
Mm-hmm.
in COINTELPROD. Jeez.
Yeah, they a lot of the White Panthers and like the MC5, like they were very much like kind of like stupid, like a lot of white radicals of the kind of the dumber but genuinely on the right side of history, but then ended up going down for like a lot of like weed charges mostly. Like
Mhm.
a lot of like, like if you were in the 60s and 70s and you were white and you went down for drugs, then you were probably like to a certain extent maybe stupid, but like probably you weren't like a freaking snitch or like an informant or something, because like they have to feed the cops somebody, and unfortunately more often than not it was people like that.
Gotcha. Trying to figure out. Let's see. What else? What else about the left do we got to expose before we move to the right? I think we got. Let's see.
Oh yeah, well, maybe just real quick. I mean, in 1966, Ramparts magazine, which was a cool radical magazine, the likes of which doesn't exist anymore, basically published that Michigan State University was used by the CIA from 1955 to 1959 to run a covert police training program in South Vietnam. So basically, as direct a connection to like the fucking heinous shit going on in Vietnam as you could get. So all the student radicals at MSU were just like, wait, what the fuck? And so like that kind of like that disclosure kind of like caused a avalanche of other disclosures of like the CIA working with a shit ton of American universities to do just like downright cartoonishly evil shit. And a lot of what we know today came out from in early on, like this Ramparts article, and then like subsequent revelations. So it was like very important in terms of like paranoid weirdo types like myself, like never shutting the hell up about this shit.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's crazy that they were able to break the story, and like I think there was some stuff in the lower appendix you wrote about where it's like there were a bunch of generals from like from this area as well. MSU doing stuff like for South Vietnam, and even like both state and UMich are like these weird hotbeds for sus activity to begin with, right? So MSU, definitely the Nasser case from a couple of years ago. It was like the site of that.
That was definitely a broader network. Holy shit!
Yeah, it was one of the landmark moments of Me Too, of the Me Too era for sure.
Mm-hmm.
And then the University of Michigan, and I would say what I can only call the Ann Arbor Industrial Complex, is something worth looking at as well. So Ann Arbor, again, is one of these places that's like it's seen as this hub of like radical liberalism and tolerance, and the like it's this and when people talk about like the excesses of college life at American campuses, Ann Arbor is like the poster child of that.
Mm.
But also like again, like Ann Arbor is a little weird because it is also this like massive hub for the University of Michigan, which is like the biggest employer in the state. There's a weird white nationalist scene in Ann Arbor too, somehow.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So
Probably related.
Maybe. And again, it's just like Ann Arbor is this like massive pocket of money, basically surrounded by farmland until you get back to Oakland County. It is a characteristically unique city in Michigan.
Yeah.
Especially knowing Detroit's nearby and didn't get like nearly as much love from a aesthetic perspective.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So yeah, I don't know. It seems like all aspects of youth, counterculture, and like whatever nascent formation of a new left was going on in Michigan had been like infiltrated.
Well, what's
drugs,
interesting,
like...
what's interesting too is that there is this counter narrative of like cool shit from Michigan. So like, okay, like, you know, the Rampart story, like there was like basically that, you know, burglary that showed that COINTELPRO existed in the first place. There's all these radical publishers in Michigan, at least they used to be, that would publish all kinds of articles that are to this day very important for like parapolitics. And there was this, you know, thing, the Winter Soldier investigation, which
yes,
I thought was like worth going into at least a little bit. For the listeners, basically, the Vietnam War was going on for a long time. 1971, this group called the Vietnam Veterans Against the War held this media event in Michigan, in Detroit specifically. And basically, it held hearings that tried to show that there was a direct relationship between U.S. military policy and war crimes in Vietnam. They wanted to explain how My Lai, you know, the famous massacre in Vietnam, was not an isolated or rare occurrence, and that it happened all over the place. And there were all kinds of things that came out about various atrocities and different war crimes that they committed. I want to say like half the shit about like the secret war in Laos came out because of this. Like all the Winter Soldier investigation ended up being hugely influential for like honestly shortening the war and ending it. And it was carried out by these Vietnam veterans right there in Michigan.
That's crazy. I was definitely unaware of this. Which again,
so like there is like this. No, it's just like there's this counter story where it's like Michigan, sus as hell. Also Michigan, a lot of really cool shit coming out of it.
Yeah, I think it's like, I don't know. You can't write off everything, I guess, just because it's been infiltrated.
Mm-hmm.
You still gotta, you know, appreciate the good work that comes out and like make sure you support the people who don't cave in to the oppression.
Absolutely. Audio, you sound like you're dying.
I can keep going. No, I'm a trooper, dude. I can do this. I'm just like, I'll be very honest. I was quite intimidated, like, about doing this episode for a while because, like, I knew I was gonna get blown the fuck out of the water when you came on.
Oh, shucks. We didn't have to tackle as much as we did.
No, you're fine. You're fine. I don't even mean it from like an endurance perspective, but just like, you know, I got a lot to learn. I will never admit to knowing everything, you know.
Shit, man, I don't know everything either.
My goal is just like, you know, to put this in a format that is, how do I put this? I am basically trying to trigger more apostasy from American civic religion, to put it bluntly.
I mean, I'd be lying if I said I wasn't basically committed to that project
Exactly. You know, we are both running in the same apostatic circles, but
as well.
um I think like I'm just trying to figure out like when we come to like the left and we've basically covered some of the events of the radical left in Michigan. We've also covered like its infiltration. You have covered the broader patriot movement and the militia movement in your excellent series with Dr. Wendy Painting on Program to Chill. So we don't need to necessarily like beat this horse, so to speak. But
Hmm.
I guess we can't really talk about the left being infiltrated without saying that, like, no, there is this bizarre network of radical right wing networks, also based out of Michigan, also infiltrated to varying degrees. And like we mentioned earlier, like there was a bit of a lull, and then all of a sudden they come back to life in the advent of the Trump era. So maybe we can briefly touch on them.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm not as up on like the malicious stuff that's been going on in Michigan. I mean, I know that it is there, but I'm not sure I have anything like really to add per se.
It's like again, like from a topical perspective too, right? Is like most
Yeah.
of my expertise is mostly anecdotal. It's mostly vibes based, you know.
Hmm.
But I would basically say that like, and this is probably indicative for the country as a whole, right? Where it's like you live in one of three zones. You live in the country, you live in a suburban area, or you live in the city, and your life does not look the same in either of the three. And you learn to be suspicious of people in other zones, for lack of a better term.
Hmm.
And in Michigan, particularly, the way that plays out is like people from the suburbs distrust people from the city, and then are either apprehensive of or fetishize country living, but then stick to the suburbs because that's where you can maintain your creature comforts and stay connected to the US supply chain, so to speak. If you live in the city, you have correctly learned that in the suburbs, you are at risk of being put into danger, and in the country, there is no one there to help you. And then if you're from a rural area, you know, you see the suburbs as either a place to like get upwardly mobile towards, or you just have fully imbibed the culture war and you see them as godless, you know. But and that's not to say that like it's fully reductive to these three capacities. This is just my observation,
What?
observing.
Yeah. What's so interesting is how divorced it is from like class-based understanding. Because like there are rich and middle class and poor people in all three. You know, so like
100%, one hundred
it
percent.
just it just doesn't map onto like any meaningful distinctions, and that's like something that all those like weird pat sock like MAGA communist idiots like probably know but choose to ignore is that like they act as if that's a meaningful distinction, and like it isn't a substitute for class like politics. Like it just doesn't work that way. There are all kinds of like rural people, like we used to call them like redneck royalty, with like you live far out but you live in a McMansion with like a huge
Mm-hmm.
lifted truck. And then there's all kinds of like rich urbanites, there's rich suburb, like it, these distinctions like are probably like overly inflated to like divide people, but like they shouldn't, you know.
They should not at all. And I think like again, our discussion here may seem excessive at first glance, but the reason why we focused on the 70s as this period, right, is this is basically the last gasp of radical politics tied to any conception of class, period, being snuffed out. And what follows in the wake of neoliberalization and financialization is the replacement of all politics with the culture war. And the culture war that started in the Reagan era is the one we have today, basically. It's a little more sophisticated. We got iPads and rechargeable phones now, but I mean, to what extent is... And I'm not trying to be reductive here. I'm actually trying to be very serious here, right? But it's like the anxieties about trans people today, the anxieties about people who live in the city versus people who live in rural areas are not necessarily the same as they were in the 70s, more so than they are like heightened tensions of the same fears people had then.
Yeah, instead of trans people, it was just fears over like a Mansonoid cult or like hippies in general, you know?
Or like in the opposite direction, you're scared of the gays, period, you know?
Yeah.
So to say the least, like the Michigan militia is one of those things where it's like, if you grew up in the suburbs like me, you live, I mean, and I'll say this very honestly, right, is that the Michigan suburbs are like probably one of the most cushy places anyone could be raised. You live in like idyllic weather. You have full access to all the bounty of the American supply chain as a consumer. You're not really that far off from other crazy stuff that you could enjoy. You live in Michigan, so if you need to like go somewhere for a natural retreat, the state's your oyster, you know? You want a beach, you can go there. You want to go chill in the woods, you can go there. Skiing and shit in the winter, they got it. But
no Cedar Point.
Well, we invade Ohio for that. Don't worry. That stretch of 75, we take the turnpike for that. But yeah, it's, you know, I think you get so comfortable that you get blinded to one, all the dark stuff that's happened in the past. One, like, I'll just be honest, I was a fucking kid. There's no way I could have known some of this stuff.
Oh yeah.
They're not telling you about it, period. But then also, like, you know, you get comfortable. You're not exposed to looking at the world with an inquisitive eye. If it wasn't for certain experiences in my life, if it wasn't for like having the chance to live abroad for a bit, if it wasn't for like, I'll be very honest, right? Like I was kind of very viciously bullied when I was younger. So one of the symptoms of being paranoid is having low self-esteem. You're always worried about what people think about you, right? But
that makes sense.
Yeah, so to say the least, right, is that I got very interested in like understanding certain political realities. I got very interested in looking at things big picture. You find a degree of peace in that, but you also try to like figure out why is the world not as perfect as it seemed to be. And that's a long digression to say that like you don't learn about the militia movement until you start to examine the dark history of racism, until you start to examine like the millenarian fears that come up in the 90s at like the end of history era, right? If you were born like at the turn of the century, you didn't live through it, basically. To put it bluntly. So you just look at like things like the militia movement, you're like, what the fuck is this? But to say the least, right, like it's very timely that I've been reading the books that I have, because I read A People's History last year, followed it up immediately with Aberration, and then I think Spencer Ackerman's Reign of Terror. And you know, Aberration is about the OKC bombing and the militia movement, and more broadly Timothy McVeigh. And then Reign of Terror situates the post 9/11 era, starting with Oklahoma City. So it's this event that, like, if you just were born after it, it's been preemptively memory hold for you. That you don't even begin to realize just how formative the militia movement, that emergent wave of conservatism and white reaction, and this coming age of like the end of history, so to speak, as this like thing that's making people scared. I don't know how else to view it. Like I look at this era of history as someone living comfortably in 2023, not comfortably per se, but like, I'm here after it happened, and I'm just like, what the fuck is this?
It's interesting, right? Because we kind of opened up the discussion talking about like the end of history from like a liberal perspective.
Yeah.
But you're right, there is the dark inverse, the right-wing view of the end of history, and it is very much more of like an apocalyptic view.
Mm-hmm.
Millenarian, things of this nature. And like there is definitely this view that like things are coming to a close, whether you want to frame that in like a Christian eschatology, or like if you want to like describe it in like Marxist terms or something, but like the American empire is ending. Like things could potentially get pretty wild. I don't know what it's going to look like, but like this country's on the decline. Like whether or not that might be good for the rest of the world, it might be pretty rocky here.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's like I don't think they correctly saw the decline for what it was, because I think like, you could, as a Marxist, you look at this and you correctly can say, as Marx predicted, the rate of profit tends to decline eventually, and this is the decline we're living through. There's only so much fucking profit you could make before I mean, you're just pissing in your mouth at this point, right? From a financial perspective. And the gargantuan amount of force it took to maintain the empire domestically and abroad, and how much the machine's wheels had to be greased with blood, literally, was unsustainable fundamentally.
Well, it's interesting actually. You mentioned C. Derek Varn, because I swear I heard him say once that probably the powers that be that really run society on an international level figured out that this declining rate of profit thing was real, and that there was a world war to deal with that. Because if you destroy enough, you almost reset the counter.
Yeah.
And I sure would be worried if, I don't know, various factions kept talking about another major war. It's a chilling prospect, but I'm just saying it's a possibility.
But yeah, I think like the militia movement comes out of that. And I think in your probably one of your earliest episodes for Program to Chill, you also talk about how financialization of farms, and particularly like the raw deal that rural communities were given as a consequence of neoliberalism, may have fanned the flames for the militia movement.
Oh yeah, no, like in the 80s, and like there were like these huge bust outs of farms where like these farms were basically fucking tricked into like overextending themselves because there were these grain deals to the Soviets. And then the fucking State Department took away or canceled the freaking grain deals to the Soviets. And then all these farmers were overextended and they all fucking lost their farms. And guess who swooped in but a bunch of financial companies to like basically buy up these farms. And wouldn't you know that like basically that core of farmers that got fucked were the initial core of the first real wave of the militia movement. It is basically a downwardly mobile, like anxiety-driven thing, but it's at least initially based in like real, like economic, like chicanery, basically.
Yeah, yeah. But then it's also, again, like there's these bizarre elements that touch up against it, like Christian identity, white identity stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I'd argue like this is just a bizarre question. You do address like a lot of this in your series with Dr. Painting, but Could you argue that maybe there's like a line between like the militia movement and like the John Birch Society, or is that too reductive?
Oh yeah, no, they're definitely like different movements and they overlap and interact in several ways. But yeah, for sure they are different. Because like the militia, okay, it's interesting, right? Because the John Birch Society fundamentally was backed by a less well-known thing called NAM, which is to say, like, I think it's National Association of Manufacturers.
Mm.
So, as you might imagine, it's basically a collection of all the different, mostly like light and medium industry, because heavy industry has their own games they're playing, but like these manufacturers were funding the John Birch Society, which itself was it's a kooky fucking org, but the whole point of it is to just push the Overton window to the right.
Basically,
At least that was the original purpose. I mean, after a certain point, it was less important, and they found other like means to carry out their goals. But like that was the initial like push, and then like the militia movement does have roots in other different groups. I'm not as well conversant in them versus like John Birch Society and NAM, but like my understanding is that it's some like weirder shit with like the army and like or the armed services of the United States, I guess, and like other factions I'm not even entirely aware of.
yeah. I guess to what extent also could you then look at like the militia movement as like the frontier has come home, basically?
I think that's a strong reading for like that like mindset, at least in terms of the members. Because like it's funny, right? Because like anytime that someone with like a left view of history looks at things, there's always this impulse to be like, oh wait, they brought the war home. And like you can look at that in Oklahoma City with the bombing, you can look at that with like Vietnam and then some of the fallout after that. But like it was like a continually reoccurring thing. So it was like the Spanish American War with the Philippines, all the way to like when there wasn't actually a frontier with like the Indian Wars. Like there was always this like recycling of like the violence on the frontier brought back home and then like exported the violence back out again. Mm-hmm. It's just like a cycle that just continues. I guess that's like what an engine does, right? I mean, the war machine, such as it is.
Yeah. So I don't know. Like my overall thing with the resurgence of the militias at this point is like they basically make their move in like the early round of like I don't know. COVID conspiracy stuff is just stuff that like I don't like getting into because it's like everything about that time in everyone's lives was so stupid. I try not to think about it. Mm-hmm. There's still so much research that would need to be done to unpack what the fuck just happened. Especially when the official story was changing almost every day.
It's not my strong suit either.
Yeah, exactly. Like there's a lot of people who are very opinionated. I'm just gonna be very frank about like I try not to get into it. But
I'm not a science guy, quote unquote.
As a science guy, I try not to get into it. How about that? How about that? Fuck it, struggle.
Honestly.
But like I'd say that like the first round prior to, like you did bring up the plot to kidnap the governor of Michigan prior. Similar elements were first seen in like the first protest of the lockdown in Michigan, where there's almost like this dress rehearsal of the storming the Capitol, basically, in Lansing. And they basically break into a legislative assembly meeting. I think the reps were all evacuated or whatever. But it was this big, like, again, I don't know if it was a show. I don't know what to consider it. Do you consider these things tantrums or do you consider these things like real organized threats? And I try not to be too hysterical with some of this. But it happened, and then it kind of sets the scene for January 6th later, as well as the kidnapping plot for Whitmer, which was foiled by informants, basically.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just kind of wondering now, like, I don't know, like seeing the Lansing thing happen first, then January 6th, like a couple months after. I'm starting to view this idea of like, is Michigan a testing ground for such shit? And there's no way to prove this. There's no fucking way to prove this. This is all conjecture on my part. But I'm
I think
starting to
that's
notice.
really good. I like that. I think it kind of is a testing ground. I mean, whether you want to like look at it, a narrow case of like the Nation of Islam, they tried it in Michigan and then they sent it over to other, like, or whether you want to like look at like MKUltra shit or literally just like how to deal with like unions, like, or how to infiltrate the new left. Like, I think you could make a case that they try things in Michigan, and then if they succeed, they might take them somewhere else.
I see. Yeah. Again, it's one of those things that like try it in Michigan in miniature and see how it plays out.
Yeah. I mean, you talk about like business conspiracies. What do? But they test a new marketing strategy in one market. If it works, they roll it out to other markets. I'm just saying.
Yeah.
A/B testing, but for like domestic, like counterinsurgency.
Jesus. That is a dark way to look at this, but yeah, I don't know. Like between the left spectrum and the right spectrum of radical politics in Michigan, something is rotten in the state of Denmark. Sorry, Michigan.
Yeah,
Although
I
there is
think so.
there is a major Dutch center on the west side of the state, though. Let's see. I think yeah, we've kind of covered like the radical movements. We've covered elite families. We even covered the universities being just weird hotbeds of sus shit. Even MKUltra. Um, and I'm not gonna. I'm just gonna say like this was an incredibly ambitious topic for both of us, trying to cover almost every sus element of a single state in the union in like a one or two or three parter podcast is ambitious to say the least. But I feel like we covered everything I planned to discuss in the outline.
Mm-hmm.
I think we even like went further than I expected, and I will break this up, but we did technically do this all in one night.
That's right. So if sometimes I'm inarticulate, chalk it up to that.
Chalk it up to that, or chalk it up to me doing a bad job editing. Who's to say? But yeah, I'd say you know, what is life in Michigan? It's not just the creature comforts of enjoying a Werner's from your porch on like on an ambient day. It's also wondering what's going on underneath all the quiet.
Mm.
And it's like, I don't know, like there's certain places you go where like the bad vibes truly are palpable. You can feel it in your bones. And I'm not necessarily like, I'm not agnostic. I'm not necessarily immune to magical thinking. I like to think of myself as more mysterious, right? But to understand history is to, in a way, like examine that feeling. In a way, it is examining, like, why is it that there's this palpable darkness in certain places? What happened here to make it feel this way? And uncovering that knowledge in a way is like it's tough work to do, but it is also cathartic in a certain way. It also like I would say studying some of this stuff, teaching people about it, bringing it to light is also a way that we can, in our own small ways, offer justice to those who were victimized and those who were hurt, even if we can't deliver, pure justice on our own terms. It may not even be our place to do that,
Yeah, no, I don't necessarily view myself as a vehicle for dispensing justice, but damn if I won't call out anytime I have the chance someone for their shitty ancestors who completely ruined something, or like honestly just people who are still alive, let's be real. Like that's more important, but like we talked at the very beginning about like a tactical retreat into the past, but like it is more than that. It's not just a retreat. Like sometimes you have to do this in order to advance at all. And like I don't know, I just think that like studying parapolitics, I don't think people have to do it to the extent that I have or other researchers. I think like you can dip your toe in it and usually you can find something useful for some other political project that you might have. Right. If you endlessly study the JFK assassination until you're, for 50 years, it's not, there are diminishing returns in anything. But like, I think that to basically make society better, you have to have your heart on fire and your brain on ice, as a certain man once said. And I think that studying history can help with that, is what I would say.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that once again, like, to understand history is it is like, I don't know, it should be one of those things that's in your bones if you identify as part of the left. Whether you're an anarchist, whether you're a communist, whether you're something in the middle, I'm not here to infight. I'm really more here just to stress that, like, we don't exist in a vacuum. We exist at like a stage that was produced by past conditions, by past decisions, by past results. We may not be in a similar place to act as people did in the past. We may not be able to do all the same things. We may ourselves feel powerless, right? But like you said, this isn't about a retreat. It's actually more of a reconnaissance. And to bring the French connection in once again, reconnaissance in French is to relearn, to re-know. Not to get linguistic up in there, but I think like that's, I don't know, to get a little mystic with it is like, I think
not for nothing is almost every spiritual tradition have something with ancestors and history in the past. Like it enriches your life for one thing, and for another, like how can you make sense of anything if you don't have history, if you don't have your family, your ancestors in any form? You don't have anything,
100%. And I think that is like the gift of human consciousness, if you will, is like it is the ability to witness, observe, interpret, and then share history with people. We can't conquer time, but that's our, our kind of like ability to stab at time. We can't beat it, but we can like make observations. We can observe it moving against us, and it may feel like an exercise in powerlessness at times, but it's not our job maybe to solve everything ourselves. It's maybe like passing on what we do observe to others and hoping that, I don't know, maybe everyone gets it and we fight this stuff off. We make these real changes. But to say the least, right, you can't do that without accepting certain uncomfortable truths. You can't do that without observing some of these unsavory elements, or maybe getting past a certain reservation that's been imposed upon you about what's appropriate to discuss and what is haram, And specifically, like, if you are brought up in the current academic model. Not to say that everything you learn there is going to be useless, not to say that everyone there is, someone you can't make friends with. It's more of like there is what is done to maintain a particular mode of production, so to speak. And then there's what goes into to protecting it. What you say and what you observe goes into that as well. And I think merely calling things into attention certain times presents a threat to the powers that be. Why else wouldn't they want you to talk about it?
Mm-hmm.
So, with all that being said, Jimmy, I want to thank you for coming to the greenhouse and having this very extended discussion with me on my home state and its very suspicious aspects. Is there anything else you want to share to the listeners before we start closing out?
No, I think that was very well said, and I agree with you. And I just want to thank you for having me.
It was a pleasure having you on, man. This is I think like one of those projects I've been like, when am I gonna do this? And having done it, I kind of feel like I've met a certain level of achievement, so to speak. I don't know how else to describe it.
Yeah, no, I definitely know the feeling for sure.
Like, yeah, I can hold my own, like, with Jimmy, not against Jimmy, but with Jimmy. You know what I mean?
No, absolutely.
And yeah, this I think is probably a capstone. This will probably be like episode 69 and 70 respectively. So
Nice.
I can move on to bigger and better things with the show. Who's to say?
Oh yeah, I think you got a lot cooking. So.
Oh, there's a lot, mon ami. We cooking with the buku. We doing the roux. We doing the jambalaya right there. The red bean and rice. Ooh, mon ami. So I'm gonna. Do you want to plug the program to chill?
Oh yeah, listeners, you should check out Program to Chill. It's a pretty cool podcast. If you've enjoyed this conversation, then you will definitely like the show.
Jimmy also has a Patreon where he releases exclusive patrons. It's not Patreon only. I think you also release them out to the general feed eventually, right?
Eventually, so yeah, not everything ends up, but yeah, for sure.
There's
free content and there's Patreon content for sure.
Yeah, the Program to Chill Patreon earns the Greenhouse Gaslighting Value for Money endorsement.
Thank you.
So yeah, thanks again for coming through, Jimmy. And thank you for putting up with the length of this particular episode, dear listener. This was another production of Greenhouse Gaslighting. I haven't used that ending before. I'm going to run with it. You can find all of our links to other social media sites and our Twitter in the description below. I'll include sources and links in the description as well. Until next time, take care, dear listener.